So we have a couple of questions in the chat. I will start with Rachel's question. So what advice do you think Cochrane should be giving to authors thinking about including non-randomized studies of interventions in their review?
What advice? Yeah, so I think it's really important that you really think about the question that you want to answer and whether non-randomized studies is going to help you answer that question. I think one of the main things we saw was that people kind of wanted to include randomized studies, but they knew there wouldn't be very many of them. So then they kind of thought, oh, we'll also include non-randomized studies instead, but they didn't really think about how that's going to provide answers to the questions that they had. So it's kind of, yeah, I think having a good rationale for including non-randomized studies and a good methods plan of how you're going to include them in addition to RCTs or instead of RCTs is definitely something. I think the protocol part of it is key to really think about kind of all the reasons why and how you're going to handle them. Hopefully that answers it.
Yes, thank you so much. So we then have a question from Darius. So what's the recommendation about handling quasi-RCTs? Should they be excluded in the first place, or should they be included in the review and then handled as high risk of bias studies?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I think kind of previously quasi-RCTs were kind of considered in a similar way to RCTs. So you'd potentially include both and you would use the risk of bias 1 tool or risk of bias 2 now to assess the risk of bias for RCTs. And obviously quasi-RCTs would score low on the randomization questions. So it probably would end up being high risk of bias. But I think from the guidance in the Cochrane handbook, it's saying that you really should be considering quasi-RCTs as non-randomized studies. So that probably means that you should be using a risk of bias tool for non-randomized studies to assess them. But this is quite a big shift because this isn't really how we kind of know this isn't really how Cochrane review authors are handling them. So yeah, I think it's moving forward, if we are going to follow the guidance in the handbook, we should be considering them under the kind of heading of non-randomized studies of interventions. But yeah, I think authors definitely struggle with kind of defining what a quasi-RCT is, because it is obviously all to do with how participants were allocated, how they were randomized. So yeah, it definitely takes a lot of kind of looking at the studies and kind of understanding whether they're truly randomized or if their allocation's not randomized enough in a truly randomized way so that they would then be categorized as non-randomized studies. So hopefully that helps.
Yes, thank you, Emma. So we have another question from Sophia. So Sophia asks, did you analyze if grade was used appropriately in the reviews? And she underlines that according to her experience, this is often not the case.
Yeah, I think we didn't really delve too much into the grade assessments. We kind of had a look to see if it had been used. I think that's what we were most interested in. Actually, did they use the grade assessment on the non-randomized studies, which encouragingly they did. But yeah, in general, it was always pretty much very low. I think there was a couple of low assessments, but generally it was very low. And it was always downgraded for risk of bias by at least 1 level, mostly 2 levels. But yeah, I think we did look as well to see if they had used Robbins I, then that obviously has a big impact on the results, because if it's critical risk, then it shouldn't be included in the study, shouldn't be included in any of the analyses. So it might not actually feature in the summary of findings table if it's critical risk as well. So we did look at that. And I think there was a couple that might not have handled that appropriately. But yeah, I think in general, yeah, I think it was probably done okay, the grade assessments, but I think, yeah, there could be probably some more work to have a look at it again. And especially when they upgraded evidence as well, we didn't really look into whether the upgrading was appropriate. So I think that, because I think people do struggle with upgrading evidence. So I think that could also be something to look at in the future as well. Another side project, maybe.
Yes, that would be interesting. Thank you. And one more question from Elizabeth. So are particular search strategies required for identification of NRSIs, or you just leave off the RCT filter?
I'm sorry, say that again, Sophia. Sorry.
I'm sorry. So are there any particular search strategies required for identification of non-randomized studies, or you just leave off the RCT filter?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not an information specialist, so it's definitely not my area, but I think from the guidance that I've read and from what I know, it is really difficult to search for non-randomized studies because there isn't any kind of filters you can use. Like you obviously wouldn't use an RCT filter if you were only searching for non-randomized studies. But I think because kind of what I mentioned in my talk was the confusion with all the terminology, like you can't really search for we want cohort studies, so we'll just use a cohort study filter. Or it doesn't really work like that because some studies won't refer to their study as a cohort. They'll use other terms or just not use a label. So I think that is the searching for non-randomized studies is a really big challenge. And I think there definitely needs to be some more work on that. But yeah, and I think it's really hard to find them as well. I think they're not always published in journals like RCTs are. So there's probably a lot of them in more like the grey literature, kind of unpublished studies. So yeah, I think the searching is definitely one of the biggest challenges of conducting a review with non-randomized studies.
Yes, I agree. So then Joanna has shared some nice resource from Cochrane Methods website that is very interesting, and thank you for that. So we have another question from Kaylee. So she says that Cochrane can sometimes lag behind the uptake of methods such as incorporating non-randomized studies. And it's the same to say that the number of reviews doing so actually decreased between 2019 and 2024. So she wonders if the methodological purity of some of the guidance is overwhelming authors and if more pragmatic guidance would help. Do you think that the trade-off of difficult to understand study features versus pragmatic but imperfect study labels might do more harm than good?
That's a really interesting point. Yeah, I think you're right. I think people really struggle with the study features part of it. I think I did when I was kind of reading it. I think people are so used to using labels, aren't they? And they know kind of what they mean. But we do know that the labels do widely are very different across lots of research. So yeah, I think there probably does need to be some kind of trade-off, which we kind of were seeing in some of the reviews where they would use the labels, but then they would also make sure they defined exactly what they meant by that label. So exactly which study features defined the kind of studies they were interested in. So yeah, I think you're right. I think there does need to be a bit more work done there with helping authors to define exactly which studies they're interested in, and to really think about the study features. But then also, I completely agree that study labels are people are used to using them and they make sense. And yeah, hopefully that answers what you've put.
Yes, thank you. And okay, I see in the comments that, yes, Benedict has added on that comment that the Robin Science, the following is very technical and not the technical guidance. Well, the guidance is very technical and maybe not very easy to follow. And okay, there is another question from Dario. So Dario says that we found that there are 70 reviews that attempted the narrative synthesis, presenting results in tables, harvest plots, or direction of effect plots. So were all of them from the 2023 cohort? This would be expected as other methods of synthesis chapter of the handbook is only available since 2019.
Yeah, that's a good point, Dario. We do have that data. So we did pretty much every question that every item that we data extracted, we did split by the years. So we definitely have that data. I can't tell you 100% that all the 17 were from 2023, but I imagine you're right that most will be because a lot of those methods were from the 2019 version. So yeah, no, I think I would say majority of them, yeah, would have been from 2023.
Okay, good, thank you. So yes, another statement. So from Kayla, he does excellent work on the review. It was great to hear about the work, and we need methodological rigor to be the backdrop of guidance, but easy to use tools to help authors apply in the real world.
Yeah, no, thank you, Kaylee. Yeah, that's definitely a good point. Yeah, I think kind of what I said, that there is a lot of guidance out there, but I think, yeah, it's hard to kind of access it all and understand it all and kind of apply it all. So yeah, if we can improve how the information is available and how it's implemented and kind of allow authors to see it in different formats. And yeah, I think a lot of work needs to be done. And yeah, I'd be very interested to hear any more thoughts on how we can make it easier for authors who are including non-randomized studies in their reviews.
Yeah. So I would like to close the questions. I would like to ask one. So what was, for this review in general, the biggest challenge that you faced in all that amount of work?
That is a good point. Yeah, I think the area with the quasi RCTs was definitely a big challenge. We didn't really plan for that, so it was a bit confusing how to deal with that. And we did feel like we were going against the Cochrane handbook with that one, which kind of didn't sit well, but I think it was the best decision. But yeah, I think the biggest challenge with a scoping review like this is that we extracted so much information, and we just have this spreadsheet full of all this data, and it's kind of we kind of trying to pick out the most interesting parts and the data which we think will be useful and the areas which we can kind of focus on going forward to kind of improve. So yeah, I think that was one of the biggest challenges, was just massive data overload and trying to condense it all together and trying to summarize it into something useful. Yeah.